Hello, nerds! Nerds for humanity. I have a super special live stream for you right now with my friend Trevor Maloney. We go back not very far, but we had a very intense experience because we were both in New Hampshire in January working on the Dean campaign. We are not here to represent the campaign. In fact, neither of us are kind of deeply engaged with the campaign, but we are both political nerds who love to talk about campaigns and love America. Is that fair, Trevor?
100%. 100%.
Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, why don't you just give folks a little bit of introduction to yourself, and then we'll jump in. Obviously, there was a little bit of a primary that happened last night.
Sure. Yeah. So Trevor Maloney, I am a Democratic operative. I've been managing campaigns for nearly 8 years now. I'm originally from West Palm Beach, Florida, which is where I'm coming from you now. Coming to you rather, and I've got experience mainly on the East Coast, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, New York, DC. But yeah, for the past 8 years have kind of been in the trenches of Democratic politics and have really enjoyed it. Obviously, there's a lot happening in our politics these days, and so I couldn't. I'm also a classical musician. I have that in my background, but I've really enjoyed being able to do something useful in the political arena during what's, I think, an incredibly pivotal time in our history. So it's a little bit about me.
All right. Love it. Love it. And so just another reminder to people, because I don't want Trevor or I to get in trouble. That's the main thing. We are not here as spokespeople for any campaign. I'm not working on any presidential campaign at the moment.
Neither.
And, personally, I've been supporting Dean, and people know that for a while. But we're now here just as two private individuals talking about politics. So let's start, Trevor, with even before we get to Michigan. What was your interpretation of New Hampshire and South Carolina, just in general?
Sure.
On the Democratic side.
And even before I get there, just to stress the point, I left the campaign in January. So for the entire month of February, I have been not affiliated with the campaign in any way. And I remain unaffiliated with Dean's campaign and any other campaign for that matter. But thinking of New Hampshire and South Carolina, I think it's more important to talk through New Hampshire, as that was I think a very pivotal play for Dean and the entire strategy for the campaign. I just think, at face value, Dean was in the race prior to the New Hampshire primary, which was the 23rd of January, for just 10 weeks or so. And, he's a third-term congressman. He was in Democratic leadership in the House, but, I would say virtually 95+% of people had no idea who he was in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. So basically starting at zero in terms of name ID. And of course, if people don't know who he is, they're most likely not supporting him. And he wound up with nearly 20% of the vote, as we're seeing here. Mm-hmm. And I just think, if you think back to 1968, which was the model that we were trying to replicate for I'm sure all of your nerds here totally know what I'm talking about when I say 1968. But for those who don't, Lyndon B. Johnson was the incumbent president. He was at that time still running for re-election, and a unknown U.S. Senator, Eugene McCarthy, decided to challenge him on the basis of the war in Vietnam. And Eugene McCarthy ended up with, I think it was 43% in that race. Lyndon Johnson got 47%. So, obviously the issues around the war in Vietnam were incredibly salient at the time. I think far more salient than any given issue that Dean ran on this time around. But to put that in perspective, like Dean gets nearly half of what Eugene McCarthy got in 1968, and Eugene McCarthy was in the race for I think a while, certainly longer than 10 weeks, and he was a U.S. senator. So I think, given what we've accomplished, and I say we because I was on the team at that point, and you were helping us out, of course, as well, Tom. I think it's really impressive. And I think it shows that there really is, if you give a sort of equal platform, or it wasn't equal, but if you give a platform, a meaningful platform to alternatives to the president, I think it shows that there's some hunger for an alternative.
Yeah, looking at these numbers again, it seems like ages ago, but the fact that 24,000 people voted for, pretty much an unknown congressman in a pretty small state, New Hampshire, it's interesting when you compare it to last night, since so many people are rightly talking about, wow, 100,000 people voted uncommitted in Michigan. And it's like, wow, Michigan's a much bigger state than New Hampshire. And nobody knew who Dean was. And there was a lot of attention on the ceasefire stuff. So the fact that, we got a quarter of what happened last night in a smaller state with a unknown candidate, it really does kind of, highlight what a big outcome that was. And I certainly was super excited about it. Less so about what happened in South Carolina. What was your take?
Yeah, so South Carolina was totally predictable. And just to give folks maybe a little bit of a behind the scenes view on things, the New Hampshire campaign, that was real. We invested a lot of money into New Hampshire. There was, a fully fledged staff that was there on the ground for most of January, probably even a couple weeks in December. Dean was up on TV. He was up on digital media. There was outside support for the campaign as well. So, we really fought for the support that we got in New Hampshire. Whereas in South Carolina, we understood that, this was Biden country. It was, it's Clyburn country. And given the importance of New Hampshire and the strategy and the limited time between New Hampshire and South Carolina, the calculation was made not to invest resources in South Carolina. So the fact that Dean ends up with not even 2% of the vote here is no surprise, given that we basically didn't campaign in South Carolina. And we were there, and we spent time on the ground wanting to show some aspect of respect for this process and the voters there. But we just understood that it would be a waste of resources to spend in a place where most people were basically already committed to the president.
Yeah, I will say I knew personally that, South Carolina was kind of like the home field of home fields for Joe, given that he, moved it to first in the nation for them, and they were the one that put him on the map last time, and Clyburn's influence is strong. I was hoping for a little bit more than 1.7, just in terms of people who might want to, support a different candidate, a younger candidate, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
But however, there were two things that I noticed that in hindsight, like kind of were not a good sign. One was I watched the C-SPAN of Congressman Phillips' speech at some big dinner in South Carolina where Biden was kind of later on.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times where the camera showed the shot of the audience, and people were not listening. Like they were literally milling around with their back to him, talking to, catching up with friends and things like that. And I guess I was a little naive thinking like, wow, this is South Carolina's opportunity to be the new first in the nation state. They're going to be like those pesky New Hampshire voters that are like kicking the tires and looking under the hood. I didn't get that sense. And so, I think that was troubling. And I think the other thing was I heard an NPR story after South Carolina where they were saying many voters didn't know there were other names on the ballot. And so, yeah, that kind of makes the 1.7% kind of like aligns with that.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would say is to have the South Carolina primary so soon after New Hampshire made it really hard if you're like a resource strapped org to go big in New Hampshire and then perform well in South Carolina because you just didn't have the money and time and people to campaign in both states concurrently.
Exactly.
I suppose the Biden people would say, well, you shouldn't have been in New Hampshire anyway.
That's what the Biden people will say in the DNC, because indeed, New Hampshire was not sanctioned to go first. So, from their perspective, we had all the time in the world to, from the time Dean launched until February 3rd, we had all of that time to campaign in South Carolina. Obviously, there are different considerations there. I will say your point about the room or the speech that Dean gave in South Carolina, that was a room full of party faithfuls. So I fully expected that he would have that kind of reaction. I will say that was not entirely representative of the experience that we had in the state. It was far more warm than that room. But I will also say, like, this is why it's really important to make sure that if you're actually contesting a state, that you spend resources communicating to voters at scale. And that's just something that we did not do. And, frankly, like, given the importance of New Hampshire and the time constraints, we didn't have the resources and the time to reach voters at scale anyway. So it's no surprise to me that when you, to your second point, when you say, like, you were a little disappointed, you were hoping that there would be more people who were looking for an alternative who would just, cast their ballots for someone else. Well, generally speaking, when you have an uncontested race, which essentially that's what the primary in South Carolina was, it's not competitive, it's not really contested. You end up with most voters who are interested in an alternative staying home, because they, why would they show up to vote for an alternative that they don't know about, that doesn't have that even if they do know about, doesn't have a good chance to win. So I think that's why you saw these kind of overwhelming margins for Biden in South Carolina.
Just we'll get to Michigan in a second, but just one last question about South Carolina. If the Dean campaign had, 5 times more money than it did, and we had the resources to really aggressively compete in South Carolina, like, what do you think how much do you think we could have gotten out of that primary?
I think for the scenario, let's presume that we're actually, we're spending real money in South Carolina to make this a competitive race. I think we're probably looking at a 10 to 15% max. If you think we got just shy of 20% in New Hampshire, a state that is far more hospitable, I think, to a candidate like Dean than the electorate in South Carolina. I would say like 10 to 15 is probably the max.
Yeah. And this is a good segue into the Michigan convo, because I know you and I often talked in New Hampshire about, wow, seems like people are pretty fired up about ceasefire and not comfortable with how the Netanyahu administration is prosecuting its response to 10/7.
Yeah.
Um, and I know that in some ways, not in many ways, I think Dean is closer to the ceasefire folks than Biden or Trump are. But
Mhm.
he wasn't like wholeheartedly saying ceasefire now.
Right.
If we had money and time, and we had maybe a bit of a stronger contrast on ceasefire, do you still think South Carolina would have been capped at 10 to 15?
Yes, I think South Carolina
Mhm.
would have been. I just don't think you get the kind of concentration of voters in the South Carolina electorate who care about this issue as deeply as voters in Michigan do.
Mm.
I mean, Michigan is very unique in that it has a meaningful Arab American population. And obviously the ceasefire issue is not just relevant to Arab Americans, but I think the point here is that because you have a community that cares about this, that is largely lives in one area in the state, it's easier
Hmm.
for them to organize. It's easier for them to make this a salient issue in their politics, and that's what you saw in Michigan. I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
like as you said, 100 plus thousand voters were voting on this issue. So
Yeah.
like that is, I don't think we're going to see that almost anywhere else. Um, so this is, I think this is definitely unique and wouldn't have mattered that much in South Carolina.
So talking about Michigan, I mean 2.7, shit, man. Uh I was hoping for 7 to 8 because I had seen some Emerson, I think it was Emerson, was putting one poll had Dean at 15 nationally, and I saw another poll that had Dean at like 7 even in Michigan, and I was like, okay, yeah, maybe we'll pick up 7 to 8, maybe
Hmm.
even double digits. Clearly, that didn't happen. I mean, my takeaways from this are number one, 100,000 people took the time to tell Joe Biden, like, not going to vote for you. And not only am I not going to vote for you, I'm going to take the time to vote for for uncommitted. The second takeaway is Dean lost to someone who had suspended her campaign, which is, I mean, there's no way to, I'm sure there is a way to spin that, but I won't try. What are your takeaways?
Yeah, well, on the last point, I'm not going to spin it, but I do think like this isn't spin. This is my actual
Hmm.
take on the matter. I think this shows you just how unknown Dean is, and again, just to like I guess highlight how impressive New Hampshire was for us. Like
Mm.
no one knew who he was, and he ended up with nearly 20% of the vote. Because we actually had a campaign, we invested resources. He
Hmm.
was out there in front of people, and we crucially we had a platform to do that. In Michigan, no one had a platform to campaign as an alternative to Biden in the primary. So what you're seeing here, I think, is just the natural sort of high information voters who really don't want Biden, or at least want an option, an alternative in this primary. And this is purely based on their own willingness to seek out information. You're not getting, like, I don't think Dean or Marianne invested any resources into Michigan. I don't think they were communicating to voters at all. So this is just purely organic. And we have to remember that, like, Marianne Williamson ran for president in 2020 when there was actually a platform. So she's got some name ID. And Dean Phillips, he this is his first time running for president. He's
Hmm.
a third term congressman. So in that way, I'm sure like if I were on the campaign, that would have been the first thing for me to say, trying to spin this, right? But yeah, I think in the aggregate, it's a fairly disappointing showing. I think for those who wanted an alternative to Biden, but it is what it is.
Yeah, and when you've used the term, Hey, Michigan, there wasn't a platform for alternative candidates the way there was in New Hampshire. Could you elaborate a little more on that? Like, what do you mean when you say there wasn't a platform?
Sure. So uh, when the two major parties sort of sanction a primary, which is what the Republicans have done this time around, and what the Democrats didn't do really this time around, you get first and foremost the media landscape. So with mainstream media outlets, you get all kinds of invitations to do interviews, not just during the day, but crucially in prime time. You get all kinds of like CNN town halls for specific candidates. You also get debates, which are really important in terms of reaching voters at scale, and that sort of earned media. That's irreplaceable, like sure you can spend your money on that, but like crucially it's a combo in my mind of having access to earned media and paid comms, because when people see your ads on TV and then they see you participating in a mainstream debate, like that's validation, that's further validation for you as a candidate. uh, Democratic candidates did not have that this time around. The state parties a lot of them were not interested in having alternative candidates there, and for the most part, like Democrats didn't even know that there was really a primary happening, right?
Mm.
So it's that kind of platform which I think New Hampshire was unique in providing, that these other candidates just did not have access to this time around, which is why, like, most people just didn't even know that there was a primary happening.
Trevor, what are your thoughts about Super Tuesday? Do you think Uncommitted will have a sequel on Super Tuesday, or what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, it's interesting. If there is a sequel, I think it would probably happen in a state like Minnesota. But
Hmm.
honestly, I haven't followed it too closely in states outside of Michigan, just because, as I said, like it's an obvious constituency in Michigan, which is why it got the most attention, media attention, etc. So um, I would assume like a state like Minnesota would probably have that, the closest to a state like Michigan. But otherwise, I'm not sure that there's enough energy, and I'm not sure there's like a well organized constituency for this in the Super Tuesday states.
Yeah, and so therefore, probably when you look across Super Tuesday, is this like a Biden 90% outcome or higher, or what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I think 90 is a good guess.
Wow.
I like I think his floor would be 80.
Yeah.
You know, like in any given state. So I think it's 90 plus. Yeah.
Which then suggests that, I mean, if he has 90 plus on Super Tuesday, I think any chance of having a brokered convention probably goes out the window unless something dramatic happens with him between Super Tuesday and the convention, right?
Right. So there is no forcing mechanism through the primaries via an alternative candidate that's feasible here
Yeah.
at this point already. Certainly after Super Tuesday, that will definitely be the case. But I was incredibly heartened to hear Ezra Klein's podcast a
Oh
couple
yeah.
weeks ago. I don't know if I'm sure you've heard of it,
Yeah.
and maybe a lot of the nerds here have heard of it already. But Ezra Klein essentially said, we have an alternative to Biden. And what this alternative looks like is having an open convention
Hmm.
and making sure that the party delegates can choose the strongest possible candidate to go against Donald Trump in the general election. The basis of this open convention, however, is the president himself and maybe those around him, more importantly, saying like, it's time to go. Let's go out on a high note. Let's allow for the younger generation to cross that bridge now, this time
Hmm.
around. But crucially, it's up to them, and it's up to the president. So
Yeah, I was very disappointed in Biden turning down the Super Bowl interview, and then uh, I was not impressed with his press conference after the Hur report. It started out fine, but it ended pretty badly, in my opinion. Um, but I think if Homeboy gets 90% or more on Super Tuesday, like the party's kind of saying they're okay with that. They don't need to see him.
well, no, I disagree with that.
Mm,
I think so. I don't think the primary electorate in any party is really reflective of the country. Um, and 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 I would go so far as to say that even the Democrats who are showing up to vote in these primaries, they're not reflective of Democrats at large in the country. The
hmm
problem is, like, when you don't have a real competitive process, when you don't have a platform, when you don't have, with all due respect to Dean, when you don't have big name candidates,
hmm
people who are well known, who are challenging the president, everyone just assumes it's a fait accompli. So, again, why would voters
mm,
sort of go out of their way um, and show up to vote for someone they don't know, and if they do know them, for someone
right.
they probably don't think is going to win. So, I want to push back on this idea that, like, the people have spoken through this
Mm,
primary process. I think it's important to respect that outcome. Absolutely, I'm not saying
hmm
we should just dismiss it, but and this is the point that Ezra Klein makes in his audio essay. The parties are in control of who they nominate for president. So there is an alternative democratic process to picking the president. And just so people know, even the primary process as we have it now, delegates are only bound, I think, on the first ballot. After that,
hmm
they can do whatever they want. The parties decide who their nominees are for president. So I do think, this is the last best hope for those of us who still want to see an alternative to President Biden, um, is that somehow he decides to drop out and we throw
hmm
it to an open convention in August in Chicago.
Okay, so I let me play back what I heard that he might get 90% on Super Tuesday. That in and of itself is not a great signal because all it says is that the people who are motivated to go out and participate in primary without knowing about any alternatives or having any nationally known alternatives like ended up voting for Biden, like not a big surprise there. It doesn't mean that the people who didn't participate are happy with Biden. In fact, it could be the opposite.
Right.
Okay, hear you on that point. So let's say he does pick up all the delegates on Super Tuesday because that's the rules, um, or most of them. Then even if he had a come to Jesus with Jill, and he's like, you know what, I've got so much work to do with Gaza and Ukraine, and I want to finish this term strong. And, honestly, I do feel a little tired. And I don't know that I want to be raked over the coals about my age every day. And I'm not sure that I want to risk having Trump win again. So I'm going to step down, or I'm not going to run for reelection. There are some people who would say, well, then obviously Harris should be the nominee, which to me is like, oh, if your objective is to beat Trump, is she necessarily the best candidate to beat Trump when you look across the whole Democratic field? Or do we say, you know what, it's not about beating Trump, it's about what's right? He picked her as his VP. How could we not make her the nominee? What's your take on that?
Yeah. I think we should choose the strongest possible candidate against Donald Trump. It's funny, that I feel like this was incredibly unique for Democrats last go around in 2020, to be so strategic about the need to find the most electable candidate against Donald Trump. We did not, as we usually do, sort of get wrapped up in the ideological debates, the things that make us feel good, right? We didn't lead with our hearts on this one. We were incredibly strategic in choosing then Vice President Joe Biden to go against Donald Trump, because he absolutely was, I think, and I was saying this all the way back in like 2017, 2018, he was absolutely the best person to go against Donald Trump. In 2020, it's not the case this time around. And so I would suggest that if we're in an open convention, that the delegates simply summon that same kind of strategic instinct and choose the best person, the most electable candidate against Donald Trump. And I think if that is your highest order goal, then I don't see how Vice President Harris makes it through a convention, because I just think there's so much by way of the kind of data that you would need to consult to make these decisions. I think there's just so much data that suggests she's not the most electable person to go against Donald Trump.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate with you for a second. Let's just say that Biden steps down and Harris, maybe despite seeing some of the data that you're alluding to, says like, hey, this is my shot. I mean, she ran for president in 2020, so clearly she wanted the role back then. And she's like, I've been your loyal right-hand person. Like, I want you to kind of let your folks know that I'm your pick, because you picked me already. How do you think the delegates would respond to a like willing and enthusiastic Harris saying like, this is my time, I will get us the win?
Yeah, I think crucially, the other incredibly ambitious and calculating aspirants to the presidency on our side would not feel encumbered by that, as they do with Biden being there. I think if Biden decides to step aside, you're going to see a very open process for this. There are going to be, I would say, at least 5, if not more, other candidates who are going to be working behind the scenes to vie for the nomination. So this would not be up to President Biden anymore. This would be up to the delegates, and I would hope that the delegates, as I said, would just consider electability in defeating Donald Trump the highest order goal. And I understand the sensitivities around the politics of passing over the first woman and woman of color vice president, and I don't want to dismiss that offhand. But I do think that is secondary to ensuring that Donald Trump isn't reelected. And so if it so happens that the delegates at the convention think that Vice President Harris is the best, most electable candidate to defeat Donald Trump, like, okay, this was a democratic process and the people have spoken. But that's just not my view, and I don't think that will be the view of a majority of delegates at the convention.
Okay, I have heard the argument that if that happened and the delegates at the convention picked someone else, like Whitmer or Newsom or Shapiro or something, that even if the delegates made that call, the base, and in particular African-American voters, would be so pissed that they would be like, screw you guys. Like, you swapped out what would have been the first Black female president for one of these other folks that is not Black or female. And then we lose Trump because we have a turnout problem.
Yeah. Well, I would counter, we already have a turnout problem. And that's why I've been, that's why I joined Dean's campaign. That's why I've been trying and my limited capacity to make sure that we have an alternative to President Biden, we have a turnout problem. And I think we're going to see that in November if President Biden is still our nominee. And I think, the other thing to consider is that, sure, if we pass over Vice President Harris, I would say, like, let's wait and see what the ticket looks like, because we have, I think, a fairly deep bench of diverse candidates who can speak to the African American community. Kamala Harris isn't the only option. So I think, let's not ignore, one, that we already have a turnout problem with the Biden Harris ticket, and two, I think an alternative ticket could inspire African Americans more. So what
would that ticket look like?
Well, so my dream ticket has Raphael Warnock on it, and here's a guy who I think, like, is fairly unique in his ability to speak both to the African American community and to, I think, keep this wider coalition together, particularly suburban voters, people who maybe are even right of center. And I think you see this in his performance in Georgia, particularly in the Atlanta suburbs. He's demonstrated in a state that is now, I think, a crucial battleground state for Democrats moving forward. He's demonstrated an ability to win with a broad coalition, a coalition that not only sort of appeals to just sort of rank and file Democrats or Democratic voters, but crucially driving up turnout amongst African Americans. He and Stacey Abrams have done a lot of great work in Georgia that I think can be replicated across the country.
So do you think, were you thinking of, where is Warnock on the ticket? Is he?
I just said a dream ticket includes Raphael Warnock. I'm not saying who should be what at this point. I don't want to get into that. But I do think at the very least he should be on the ticket.
I could see like a Whitmer Warnock combo.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you think Warnock would activate more voters than Harris could?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Why is that so obvious?
Let me not give a knee-jerk reaction to that question. So what I think at the very least is that Raphael Warnock alienates fewer voters than Vice President Harris. And I think that is crucial. One of the best sort of trite advice in politics is about addition, not subtraction. And I think when you have a choice between two candidates, when one alienates more voters than the other, like, that's cause for concern, And I absolutely believe that Raphael Warnock alienates fewer voters than Vice President Harris.
All right, we have some audience questions, Trevor. I know we've been talking for over 30 minutes, but do you have a few minutes to hit some nerd questions?
Let's do it.
All right. In no particular order, from Jonathan, should Dean drop out if he doesn't win Minnesota, or maybe broader, like, under what circumstances should he drop out?
This is tough for me because I worked for the congressman and I worked on the campaign, and I know there are a lot of supporters out there who still believe in his candidacy. I mean, my honest opinion is that it doesn't really matter if Dean drops out. I think, as we've seen in Michigan, like, if he doesn't spend any money, and I don't think he has the capacity now to raise any money, if he's not spending any money, no one knows who he is. So no one's really going to vote for him. And he's not going to meet the 15% threshold to get delegates in a lot of these states. So he's a non-factor. So, it's his decision to drop out. I think, if you're basing this off of data, he doesn't have a path. So on that basis, he probably should drop out. But he's simply a non-factor.
Let me play devil's advocate using an argument I've heard from a lot of the really hardcore Biden supporters who find Dean very annoying or they really, really don't like him.
Mm-hmm.
And one of their arguments is, I see the logic in it. One of their arguments is like, hey, if your guy has no path and he's out there telling everybody how Biden is such a weak candidate, like, just get with the program. Even if he is a weak candidate, like, he's the candidate we have, not the candidate we wish we had. So let's just go.
Yeah, I mean, I strongly disagree with that.
Mm.
I think we have to do everything we can between now and when a candidate is actually nominated and wins and is given the nomination at the convention in August. We have to do everything between now and then to ensure that candidate is not Biden. Now, if we're post convention and Biden is now our official nominee, then absolutely. Like, no one should be criticizing President Biden if they don't want to see Trump reelected. But we're not at that point. And I keep stressing to everyone, if we want to celebrate how we live in a democracy, and if we want to draw a contrast with a party that is increasingly illiberal, then we ought to practice democracy ourselves. And telling us to sit down and shut up when there are months and months to go before this is finalized, I don't think that honors any kind of democratic ethos or value. I think Dean is, as I said, a non-factor in terms of the primaries themselves, these primary contests. He's not going to win any of these upcoming primaries. However, I think it's still important for him to use his platform to persuade, motivate all of us to seek a better option.
Got it. So it's kind of, he would pivot to his previous talking points when he wasn't a candidate himself, trying to encourage the party to think about alternatives, and that's serving the party's long-term interests. If you assume that a Biden in November would be a losing ticket.
Exactly. And I mean,
Yeah.
if you think of it from his perspective, I think he probably believes he has a duty to try
Mm-hmm.
everything in his power uh, to force an alternative to the president. But as I said, I think that's all fine up until the convention. And once we have a nominee, whether we like that nominee or not, I think if your goal is to ensure that Trump isn't reelected, you've got to support the Democratic nominee.
All right. Next question from Sue, who's a channel member. Thanks for your support, Sue. What should Dean do differently to prepare for Super Tuesday?
Yeah, just a quick sort of double down on what I just said. Unfortunately, I don't think he has the resources to do anything. So he's a non-factor. I think donors have given up on the campaign. They don't see a path, and I think that's fair. And so there's not much he can do between now and Super Tuesday.
All right. Next question from Steve. Isn't it more accurate to compare uncommitted to other primaries via percentage rather than raw votes? Because turnout is different. I've heard this argument, which is like, we were talking about, wow, 100,000 people voted uncommitted. And then I think the counterpoint to that is, well, it's only,
13% or so.
13% or 13.2%. So, what's the big deal? There was uncommitted against Obama. This is no different. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think this is something that people really miss, and I get really animated about it. President Biden won in 2020 by an electoral college landslide, or something close to a landslide. But if you actually look at the amount of raw votes that that put him over, it's about 44,000, 45,000 votes across 3 states, I believe. And so when you think of the raw vote, and I think this is why people are paying attention to the raw vote in Michigan, that is enough. If these voters say, to hell with Joe Biden, I don't give a shit if he's the nominee against Trump. I just can't support him because he has allowed for the genocide of my people, or for people in general. If that is their take, if you've got 100,000 people, even if 50,000 of them decide that they're not going to show up to vote for President Biden, that could be enough to swing the state of Michigan for Donald Trump. And so the raw vote here matters, from when you're trying to game out what happens in the general election if these are the two nominees.
Yeah, I mean, so many of us, I think, forget that even though Biden won last time, it was by like 24,000 votes in 3 states, and the margin was very, very razor thin. Obviously, he crushed it in California, but that's
Right.
kind of assumed. It's these swing states that matter.
Exactly.
And if every state has a pocket of people who are pissed about his approach to the Israel-Gaza conflict,
Yeah.
and I doubt they would vote for Trump, but maybe they go for Stein or they just stay home.
Or stay home. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, next question. I don't understand why there's no debate in the Democratic Party. Do you think Biden has what it takes to beat the Energizer Bunny, Trump?
Well, my answer is no. But that is, I think, the question. To your point, Tom, earlier you mentioned that you were disappointed that President Biden didn't do the Super Bowl interview. Well, if your assumption, and I think this is the assumption of the White House, if your assumption is that by showing people more of President Biden, you sort of increase the chances that people don't like him, or don't think he should be running again, then you're going to do everything you can to shield him from public scrutiny. And so I've seen the president just as recently as maybe three weeks ago in South Carolina, and I was honestly, I was just like shocked. I didn't know what to say or think. He just seems, and I've met him several times. He just seems like not with it. Like physically, you can tell he's frail. He's a lot slower, and you can observe this with your own eyes and ears. And I don't buy into the hysteria about dementia and all of this stuff. I don't think that's true. But if you're thinking about energy, as Sue kind of implies here, relative to Trump, I don't think the president has the energy to wage a winning campaign against Donald Trump. I just don't.
So obviously there's some embellishment. It's campaign season, but it sounds like are you? What's your interpretation there? Like, I think it was a week ago, there were a whole lot of cabinet members on national interviews saying, I have been with him behind closed doors. He is completely in control. He has a mastery of details. He has the most probing questions. He holds your feet to the fire. He is on top of this. Like, don't worry, he's got this.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible that like he just sucks in these like big group events, but I guess where it matters most, he's totally on top of things? Or what's your read?
Yeah, I think that's possible. But I'm reminded of Jon Stewart's first show back, The Daily Show, and he said, "Well, if all of you have seen this in person, it's like, is there any video of this that you can show us?" Like it gives me very like totalitarian, authoritarian regime vibes when you've got all the senior leadership coming out and saying, "Oh, the leader is a certain way behind closed doors when you can't see him. Like, take my word for it. He or she is okay." But like this leader can't demonstrate that themselves in public. Like, that's a little disconcerting. Like that, when I see a bunch of senior officials come out and say stuff like that, it makes me like less confident in the president's ability to like win this race and to run the campaign. It does not make me more confident. Quite the opposite. It's kind of
Yeah.
creepy, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I mean, and speaking of Harris, I think she was like so like vocal about how he is so in control. I was like, whoa, chill out. Like, why are you yelling? Like,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can imagine a similar scenario after Woodrow Wilson had his stroke, or you can
mm,
imagine a similar scenario when President Roosevelt is towards the end of his life. You know, like I mean, after Reagan was shot, like they said, oh, like everything was fine. Everything was not fine after Reagan was
mm,
shot. You can imagine a scenario with Donald Trump when he got COVID. Like, oh,
yeah.
everything is fine. He was like almost gonna die,
Yeah.
and we're learning more details about that after the fact. Like, I do not trust the word of senior officials when they tell us something that we aren't able to observe with our own eyes and ears.
Yeah. All right. Let's take a few more questions. What is your interpretation of the votes in Michigan between Biden and Trump? Like, should we interpret anything about? Let's see here. We've got 600,000 going for Biden last night, and 760,000 going for Trump. Is there anything to that difference? Like maybe the Republican one was more contested, so more people showed up, or or is there something there that like, oh shit, that Trump got 150,000 more people to vote for him last night than Biden?
Yeah, no, the Republican primary has been competitive and contested this cycle.
Hmm.
So I would venture to say in almost every contest, you will have more Republicans and raw votes turning out than Democrats, simply because, as I said, when people
Hmm.
think it's a fait accompli, why would they show up to rubber stamp something that they think is already going to happen? You know?
All right. Next question is from Poker Pirate. Do you believe Newsom is the top choice? Is he the pocket aces for us?
No, I do not believe that. I do believe he'd be a strong contender, and that if we have an open primary or an open convention, that the delegates will strongly consider him, given how aggressive he has been as a surrogate for the president, and also just on behalf of democratic ideas and values. But I don't think he's the top choice for Democrats. I think we have a lot of great options, fortunately.
So in this scenario where Biden says, I'm not going to run again, and I encourage everybody to support Vice President Harris,
Hmm.
you think Newsom would advocate for himself to be considered?
Uh, I do think so. Um, it's funny, like I'm not sure it's really important to game out how this all happens, but I would not consider, I would not assume like he'd be the first one to
Hmm.
like put his name in contention. Certainly not in public. I think he'll immediately do the behind the scenes maneuvering, and by him I mean his team. But I think there's going to have to be someone else, given the sort of home state complications there, to put their name in the ring before he does.
Yeah, the thing with Newsom, he was on, I think he was on Meet the Press this weekend, and they had asked him, well, would you consider being the nominee if there were, like a contested convention? And he was like, what are you talking about? I would never even think of this. And I'm 1,000% behind the Biden Harris ticket. And it was kind of like the whole Biden cabinet saying like Biden's amazing behind closed doors. He like protested it so much that I'm like, Newsom, I'm pretty sure the thought has crossed your mind. Don't act all surprised and offended by the
Yeah,
question.
and I mean, in defense, like I don't. There's nothing nefarious about him denying it. I just think in politics, if you are on the president's team, you got to be on his team. You can't invite scenarios or hypothetical situations where he's not at the top of the ticket and you're now suddenly talking about what you're going to do. You can't even allow that as a topic of conversation in public. So I don't, I get where he's coming from, but I mean, we're not naive. He would certainly be running.
Yeah, and I live in California. He's my governor. I've voted for him, but I have to say, like, if I had to choose between him and Whitmer or Shapiro or Booker, I mean, there's a lot of great, or Klobuchar. I think he doesn't score very high for me on like the authenticity kind of meter.
He's very slick.
I feel like, oh, am I about to buy a timeshare? Do I get free tickets to Disney World if I take this tour with you?
Yeah, I think that's his biggest weakness, honestly.
Yeah,
he's too clean, too slick. It's almost too much.
All right, here's another one. Ooh, let's be very careful about how we handle this question. If Dean loses, does he become a third-party candidate for 24 in the future? What do you think?
Dean has already lost. He doesn't have a path to victory. And I do not think he will be a third-party candidate. I will say this, however. If there is any way, and this would have to be verified by some kind of polling data or whatever, but if there's any way that a third-party ticket can prevent Donald Trump from becoming president, even if Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee, I do think Dean would be interested. But here's why I say no, he's not going to be a third-party candidate. I just don't think we're there yet in our politics in the States where a third party can win. And so I just find it hard to see how they would get enough votes in a sort of like predictable way, in a way that's controllable, to prevent Donald Trump from being the nominee. So I don't see a path for Dean. So in my mind, he has already lost the primary, and I don't see a path for a third-party candidacy, one that like ensures Donald Trump's defeat. So I don't think he would do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think say what you want about Dean for all the kind of anti-Dean people out there, but I think one thing for me is like super clear is he does not want Trump to be back in the White House. So I don't think he would ever go on a third-party ticket if he believed that would harm the probability of blocking Trump.
Right.
And he would definitely not want to help Trump.
Yeah, definitely not.
Okay, so a couple more quick ones.
Sure.
Marianne is back. What do you think?
What? She's not back.
She unsuspended.
Oh, did she really?
Yeah.
Wow, even I missed that. Okay.
Yeah, I think that happened today.
She's not back. Like obviously she, if that's the news, she will try running again. But I don't know what she's doing. I haven't even heard this news. But there is no path for Marianne Williamson. There just isn't. And like she was in debt. Based on the last FEC filings, pretty significant debt, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't know where she would be getting the money to even campaign. But I guess anything is possible. Like if she finds the money to make these races competitive, then there's a possibility that she can be a relevant factor here. But I would bet against that in all of the online betting markets.
So I'll present an alternate perspective here. You and I have supported long shot candidates in the past. So, and Marianne, while having a suspended campaign, has done better than Dean has now in the last two in South Carolina and Michigan. I think she might have a stronger pro ceasefire stance than Dean, and clearly could draw some big contrast with Biden. Wouldn't that give her maybe a voice at the table at the convention? Maybe not as a selected nominee, but like she may have some influence, especially if Dean continues to kind of diminish in his support, and then the ceasefire stuff keeps picking up. Is she the potential ceasefire candidate?
No, not at all.
Hmm.
I wouldn't overstate, like Marion's doing better than Dean as a suspended candidate. Like they're basically getting the same 2 to 4%, right?
Mhm.
Like this is nothing. For those of you who aren't familiar with delegate rules, like you need a 15% threshold in a lot of these states, if not all of them, to even be considered for delegates. So there, she's and let me just hit this point a little harder. She actually spent real money on a campaign in New Hampshire, and I mean, maybe Tom, you can pull those results up, but
Mhm.
I don't think she got more than 5%. She certainly didn't get 15%, which is the minimum threshold to get delegates. So even if she
4%. She
yeah,
got
she
4.
got 4% in New Hampshire, and that's spending money trying to talk to voters. She was there on the ground every day, like. So the difference between her spending money and not is like a percentage point, it seems, right? Because I think most Democratic voters don't see her as a viable candidate. She does not have a path. She does not have a path to the nomination, and further, she doesn't have a path to relevancy because you need delegates to be relevant in this contest and at the convention. So without delegates, without a real path to the nomination itself, like she's not. I don't think anyone is going to seriously consider her as an alternative to President Biden.
Could she not play the same role that we're saying Dean might be playing, which is encouraging the party to reassess Biden as the candidate, and building the demand for looking at alternatives, even if the alternatives aren't them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's essentially what her current role is,
Hmm.
and suspended campaign or not, like it doesn't really matter. Like her campaign being unsuspended now does not change her relevancy in this race or in this conversation. In my opinion, um, I do think like she will continue, of course, to make the case that we need an alternative to President Biden.
All right, second to last question. What's Dean's political future?
It's a good question. I don't know if I don't know if he'd be interested in running for office again, but my sense is that let's game out a very awful scenario, the first one. President Biden is the nominee, no alternative
Hmm.
is chosen, and he loses to Donald Trump in November. Well, then I think Dean has a lot of political capital to spend if he wants to run um, for another term somewhere. Don't discount the fact, however, that there are going to be a lot of Democrats in this scenario who still say, well, Joe Biden lost because you ran against him. So he's still going to have to deal with, I think, a lot of hurt feelings on the Democratic side. If President Biden is the nominee and he wins, I think Dean has virtually zero political capital, and it would be very hard for him to I think win another race for any other office. If we have another nominee, win or lose, I think that's better for Dean politically than
Mm.
Biden being the nominee and winning, just for his own political capital. Obviously,
Hmm.
it'll be great for the country, but for Dean's
Sort
political
of.
fortunes, well, but I do agree. If and I just want to state this for the record, like if
Hmm.
President Biden is the nominee post convention, I am 100% in favor of uh, President Biden, the Biden-Harris ticket, because I don't want to see Donald Trump reelected. I really don't.
Yeah, I will hold my nose
I will
and vote for
absolutely
him
hold my
too.
nose. Yeah, yeah.
However, if you ask me, okay, let's say Biden wins the day after, do you feel comfortable and will you sleep at night knowing that he's going to get the 3 a.m. calls? And I will not be comfortable. I'll be like, I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not
no,
sure how he's going to do.
I won't be comfortable, and I think there's a strong chance that we would see at some point in that second term a President Harris. I'm not particularly thrilled about that, but I just, like I can. What does give me some kind of comfort is that I think in that scenario we have such a deep bench of very talented, competent Democrats that the functioning of the federal government will be fine. Like we will be okay. I can't say that about a Donald Trump presidency. Like we're gonna have such shitty people in positions of power. Like it's not just him, right? Like that's what people need to understand. It won't just be him. He's going to be totally empowered to choose loyalists and lackeys in all of these positions within the federal government. He learned his lesson, and more importantly, his team learned the lesson last go around, not to appoint these sort of establishment friendly people who are going to stand up to him. He won't do that this time around, in my opinion. And so it'll be a very like kind of aggressive, negatively aggressive administration with people that don't necessarily instill confidence. And that'll be almost across the entire federal government, not just, one or two people at the top.
Yeah,
Sorry
it's
for the
interesting.
nightmare scenario.
Yeah, that is like, yeah, I just had this vision of like Bannon and the Trump kids and the pillow guy, like all these like characters coming
It'll
out
be
of the
rough.
woodwork.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think we'll survive, like I'm not a doomsday person in that way, but it'll be rough. It'll be a rough 4 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. One last thing, and then that scenario where Biden wins and he steps down and it's President Harris, like I actually would feel better about that than if Biden tried to do the whole 4 years.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Because I mean, Harris is not a great candidate, but I think she's smart and she's thoughtful. And maybe that's the best way for her to become president versus having to run a campaign, because she wasn't that effective in 2020 leading up to Iowa. For her,
I think that's
for
the
her own
only
campaign.
way she could be president is
Yeah.
by not being elected, unfortunately.
All right. Sue wants to know, what is Trevor's ex, formerly known as, Twitter account? I actually couldn't find one. I found one, but you were talking about music. I was like, I don't think that's his political account.
Hopefully none of you can find any social media account of mine because I don't do social media. Now I've got probably old accounts that are out there somewhere. But I quit social media in 2018 before the end of the midterms that year. And I will take this quick opportunity to get on my soapbox. I just really think it's a negative influence on us as humans, and certainly on our culture. And sure, some people do it better than others, but like these algorithms are really powerful and they tend to pigeonhole you into content that makes you more fearful, more angry. Like I'm a big believer in sort of like limiting strongly or just getting off of social media altogether.
All right. Well, thank you, Trevor, for coming on and spending over an hour.
My pleasure.
It went by quickly. It reminds me of our breakfast chats.
Exactly.
Oh my God.
Yeah, well, I'm a fellow nerd, so I love this.
Yes, absolutely. We'll have to have you back on for sure. Have a great rest of your day and enjoy that beautiful Florida weather. It looks a little different than Manchester.
Yeah, exactly. Good to see you, Tom.
See you later, buddy. Bye.
Take care.
All right. That was a fun chat. And you guys were having a good time in the live chat as well. So I'm glad that we all found this useful. But you know what's coming. We got to thank our channel members. We'll thank our channel members, and then I'll give you some more thoughts. And maybe some people have been asking me, like, Tom, are you going to be aggressively advocating for Dean? So I'll share kind of my approach to where I'm going to be spending my time. But before I share that update, let me thank the people who make Nerds for Humanity possible, and that is our channel members. And you know who our biggest member is? Our biggest member, most generous supporter of our streaming software and podcast hosting fees. By the way, I pay for podcast hosting fees. Well, our members, I do, and then our members help a little bit. So if you like audio podcasts, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you can write a review, that would be awesome. And I'll do a shout out in a future episode to your review. So Soldier One, Senior Vice President, biggest supporter. Next level down is our Vice Presidents, our officers, Kristen, Slevin, and Bike. Thank you, Kristen and Bike. Vice Presidents. And then we have our Hardcore, which are Gene David, DK, Jekalego, Mr. History, Mona, Von, Yang, Dean, Galessa, J Parent, Dana, Jason, Daniel, Mickey, Yoda, and Unkiyu. And then at the entry level, verified nerds, only $1.99 a month, cancel anytime. I'm going to scroll through these wonderful nerds, all verified to be supporting great political analysis and commentary, and open-mindedness, and some data and charts as well. So what's not to love? Okay, so now I'm going to share like what my current thinking is regarding promoting Dean Phillips, or how do I want to spend my time? You know, I think last night's outcome in Michigan was so tough for Dean that it's going to be hard for me to beat the drum really hard trying to convince Democrats to support Dean. I think that kind of sucks, to be honest, because I think Dean's a great guy. And I think he's a former CEO, and he's a 3-term congressman. He comes from a purple district, and he's a vice chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus and ranking member of the Subcommittee on Middle East and North African Affairs. And he's one of the most bipartisan members of Congress. He's smart, he's young, he's authentic. But you know what? Like, it's just not in the numbers. And he probably started his campaign too late. And, you know, it's not his fault. You know, maybe he could have started earlier. I don't know. I know he was trying to get other people to run. But I think it's not productive for me to kind of try and tell all these Biden people that they should support Dean, because if Dean's not going to pull it out in the primaries, you know, I didn't need him to win, but, you know, I think if he had gotten more than 5% in Michigan, I'd be probably saying something different. But South Carolina and Michigan were pretty tough outcomes. Now, Trevor would say, hey, that's not really an indication of anything. It's just that nobody knows about him, and the only people that go to primaries in an uncontested incumbent primary season is a hardcore party loyalist. So, you know, don't read into it. Yeah, I get that. But I guess I would say, if you've got the riz to challenge the president and win a brokered convention, you should get more than 2.7%. By the way, I'm sure my sons would be like, Dad, that's not how to use the term riz, but I don't know. I just did it. So what are you going to do about it? So what am I going to do? I think I'm going to focus on two things that I care deeply about. One is that I have deep conviction that Joe Biden has a very big chance of losing to Trump, and therefore the Democratic Party should pick someone else. Doesn't have to be Dean, probably won't be Dean. I'll take a Whitmer, I'll take a Booker, I'll even consider taking a Harris, maybe Newsom, Shapiro, Cooper, Pritzker, Klobuchar. It's a long list. So right now I'm hoping that Joe and Jill walk up the hill and have it come to Jesus. Look at the numbers, focus on the country, and decide to pass the torch. That would be amazing. And then we'll pick someone leading up to the August convention. The other thing that I do feel strongly about, which I know is very controversial, and I've definitely caught a little bit of heat on Twitter for this. I am not comfortable with U.S. taxpayer money buying arms to be dropped on Gaza. Like, I'm just not down with that. I'm not saying Israel doesn't have a right to respond to the 10/7 invasion. I'm just saying, as an American citizen and taxpayer, I don't feel comfortable with our government being so much of an enabler of the Netanyahu strategy. If it's about money for the Iron Dome, no problem. If it's about money for other kinds of defensive needs, no problem. But dropping like 2,000-pound bombs in neighborhoods, knowing that you're not even going to get to the tunnels, I think at this point it's well beyond proportionate. 30,000 dead Gazans, I think 10,000 of whom are children. Like, even if you say like, hey, that's justified, like, it is not America's job to fund that. And if it were, then the American people should be behind it. And I think most Americans are saying, whoa, there should be some conditions on this military aid. And I think that's why, it's another reason why Biden, is struggling to kind of have like even bigger primary outcomes. So yeah, I think I'm going to spend my time on a more balanced, really two-state first approach to the Middle East. I also think our congressional representatives, like, if they're voting for military aid that their constituents are not in support of, and I don't buy the argument like, oh, it's just because it's mixed in with the Ukraine and Taiwan aid, so you have to take the whole thing. It's like, I don't know, man. This is life or death. Like, it's $14 billion to the campaign against Gaza. I'll be the first to condemn Hamas. They're murderers and rapists and just evil. I don't think that justifies killing everybody that lives above them. That there are plenty of people in Gaza who are not part of Hamas. And I also think like this over-the-top response, as President Biden said, over the top, is probably going to create more Hamas. I mean, if my parents were killed by an Israeli airstrike, even if I weren't in Hamas, I don't know how I would feel about Israel after that. Probably be pretty angry and want retribution. And then the cycle of violence would just kind of continue. So yeah, that's how I'm thinking of spending my time. I know it's a very tough topic. I have a lot of friends who vehemently disagree with me on this one. I think ultimately it comes down to like, there's a right to respond, but then there's also a right not to fund that response, especially as a third party. So let me know what you guys think in the comments about this whole Gaza-Israel thing. I hear the argument that, hey, the Hamas raped and killed and was extremely violent. They haven't surrendered, and they're holding, I think, 100+ hostages. I get it. I'm not saying they're terrible. I'm just saying, like, okay, so is the solution to kill another 30,000 Gazans? Like, when does that stop? I know Netanyahu says the complete elimination of Hamas. I don't know how do you measure that? And aren't you creating more Hamas now? So, like, what's going to be left of Gaza? All right. Well, let's leave on a more positive note, which is people voted in the Michigan primary. They participated. There's only good that comes out of participation. We have a big Super Tuesday coming up next week. I like the fact that Marianne unsuspended. I like her. I think she should have. I don't think she gets enough credit, and I think it's good when there's more competition and more voices at the table. So, with that, I'm going to say bye, nerds, and don't forget to like. If you can't become a member, the next best thing to do is like and share. And I know Sue Bowman does everything. She likes, she shares, and she's a channel member. So thanks, everybody. Bye, nerds.